Here we are again. Shannon B. Douglas. This is while we were asleep. Today, I'm Harbourfront in Toronto. It is Wednesday, let's say the 28th of June, and I came to Toronto yesterday via to meet with a group of concerned parents, teachers, and activists to talk about and to hear about some of the things that are going on in the public school system because I'm running for Ottawa Carleton OCDSB, District School Board, in Zone 3. That is Rio Vanier. Uh, why am I running? Well, I'm going to get into that a little bit, but I thought an interesting question I might share an answer to with you today is why do I have a pseudonym? This channel, Shannon B. Douglas, is a pseudonym. My legal name, Shannon Boschy. That's the name I'm running for on the ticket. And it's because I wrote a book a couple of years ago and I wanted to separate my professional life from my literary life. And I wrote a book. It's published on my Substack as an audio chapter, a series of audio chapters called Chasing Quicksilver. And I leave the question of Quicksilver open through the book, but it's really about some of the biggest questions that we as human beings can possibly ask and have ever asked. The big philosophical questions. Who am I? And what am I here for? And my journey chasing Quicksilver began, well, a very long time ago, and was inspired by a friend of mine. His name is George Mann. He's a traditional Nishka carver, painter, and knowledge keeper. He's a storyteller and a keeper of memory. And he's a living embodiment of the land that he lives on today, the land that, and the ocean and the rivers that he lives from in a traditional way. And I met George in the cafe. He was painting a mural. And we had a long conversation because I was already a few years into my study of comparative religions and philosophy and storytelling. And I asked him to tell me about the stories that he was painting in the mural on the wall. And I offered him a cigarette, tobacco. And instead of smoking the cigarette, he broke it in the ashtray and he lit it on fire. And he said, "You've been asking sacred questions, some of the big questions. And so I'm going to say a prayer to the Creator. And we're gonna open the doorway between this world and the next so that the Creator and our spirit guides can participate in this conversation." And I asked him about the nature of a vision quest. Now, deep down, and I'm going to spoil the book, deep down, a vision quest is the question, who am I and what is my purpose? And that's an answer that each of us individually in our lives has to explore and come to. And cultures from all over the world, religious and philosophical traditions, observe this with different rituals marking the same kinds of events. So if you have familiarity with the Christian tradition, for example, we have a notion of a baptism or the notion of a confirmation. That is, when we are of a certain age, when we become adults, look at this beautiful view. When we become adults, we undertake a ritual and a demarcation in time through that ritual of becoming adults and taking adult responsibilities. In some cases like this, in some cultures, it involves changing your name. And you leave your childhood name behind and you take on a new one. And this is not unique to Indigenous culture here on Turtle Island in North America as we know it. It is found in all traditions and all cultures of the world. And in many times, in many cases, and in many rituals observed, these vision quests, these undertakings involve trials, very, very difficult trials, sometimes involving body modification, scarification, cutting off fingers, I've read in some stories, as part of a sacrifice or making things sacred. So there's a natural human evolutionary, social evolutionary process that we go through. And we've observed all through time and all through history. Now, some of the great figures of wisdom traditions in our religions and philosophies, and I'm not a practicing Christian, although I'm very familiar with Christian texts. Uh, and so when I speak about different religious figures, I want to be clear that I'm not proselytizing. I'm just reflecting on the things that certain teachers and philosophers have shared with us. When Jesus went into the desert to fast, he fasted for 40 days before he was baptized. And he went through trials, right? That sacrifice of self immolation, of ascetic practice. Ascetic is discipline that causes self harm. It involves very difficult trials. And at the end of the 40 days, he faced a temptation. His question was, what is my relationship? Now, the Buddha did the same thing. And these aren't isolated figures in history, but they're some of the biggest names that we know. The Buddha did the same thing. He fasted for a year. And then he sat under the bo tree and he was visited by three devas or three temptations. And he took this fasting. He was so emaciated, they say he only ate one hemp seed, like just a little bit bigger than a grain of rice, every day for a year in his fasting. Now, you have to remember that some of these stories are mythologized and they're ritualized and they're made profound, a bit like comic books, like Superman's able to leap over tall buildings. I don't want to offend anybody with that, but we have to recognize that there are metaphors in play in religious stories and traditions that aren't literally true, but they have functional and important structural meanings that uh, that are powerful for human beings. Now, the question that we're asking, and this is part of the reason why I'm running, you know, we've gone through tremendous technological change. We are living in the fastest, most transformative, revolutionary time in human history. The internet coming online 25 years ago, and most of humanity, certainly the developed world led the way here, has thrown us into, as a species, as a society, as cultures, into this massive transformational moment. And we've lost touch with ritual. We've moved our attention out of our bodies and into digital spaces. And we've dissociated. And our children growing up have grown up in imaginary worlds, in mythic places and spaces, in the space of story. But there's no coherence in the story online. There's no structure to it. There's no alchemical and archetypal process. So our children are craving at a deep level this transformation, this transition from childhood to adulthood. We have nothing collectively in our rituals to mark this. And so there's a void in the psyche of our kids. Now, since 2015, there's been a massive spike in the number of children who are identifying as transgender, mostly girls, where historically we'd never seen that before. And I have friends who are trans. They suffer from a condition that we call gender dysphoria, where they have a rejection of their biological sense and a conflict within their psyches about how they model and move through the world. And I'm going to be interviewing some of those people over the coming months to talk to them about their experience. But we now have, by a Pew Research study just 2 weeks ago, data that says 5% of people under the age of 30 in the United States are identifying as transgender or gender nonconforming. That's 1 in 20 people. Historically speaking, that number was 1 in 5,000. I had a brief conversation with Dr. James Cantor, who's been an expert in the field for decades. And he said gender dysphoria is uncommon in naturally occurring without other influence, about 1 in 5,000 people. And the numbers that I learned when I was in university studying abnormal psychology was about 1 in 10,000. That's a very, very small number of people. But what we have today is an explosion of this. And the question that seems to possess people, the question that seems to grab the minds and become a worm of rumination in children, especially girls, is not who am I, but what am I? Am I a boy or am I a girl? This is very sadly a wrong type of question to ask. It's this instinct that we have for story and meaning and purpose and orientation within our environment, in our psychic landscape, in our physical landscape. And instead of asking who we are, why am I here? What is my purpose? What's my nature as an adult? And going through a transition from childhood to adulthood, we're asking, what am I? And we've limited the question from the full potentialities of life and existence to one: what is my gender? How do I express myself? And this is institutionalized now because we're teaching it in schools. And it's a question that we've never asked ourselves before, ever in human history. So I've now spent 30 years studying comparative religions, mythology, storytelling, psychology, depth psychology, narrative structure. We've never, as a species, asked that question before. And if we don't get the question right, we can't find the answers. So this is one of the reasons why I'm deeply concerned about what's happening with our kids and with the number of children who have suddenly become possessed with a question and finding an answer to that question: what is my gender? We need to shift that question if we want to help our kids actualize their full potential. Now, perhaps a child does legitimately have gender dysphoria. And there's a process for evaluating that. And there's a way that societies have always incorporated some of these people into their communities, into their natures. I don't dispute that people who are gender non-conforming have always existed. We've had Joan of Arc's. There haven't been large numbers of people, but there are certainly men who have felt more comfortable in kind of women's roles and women's traditions. And my best friends and my social circles, my whole life, have been with women. And I'm the person in the house. I'm the who tends towards more of the domestic. I love to cook. I love to keep the house running. I do the grocery shopping. I I have some limitations. I think that my wife is better at a lot of things than I am. But that happens to be my interest and happens to be my nature. It doesn't take away from my biological reality. So this quest, the big quest, the great human quest, the question, who am I and what is my purpose, is the one that unleashes our potential. It's the one that opens us up to the future. It's the one that helps us actualize who we really are and move into the adult spaces of the world. The last thing that happens with that ritual process is that we leave childhood behind. We leave our childish ways and we take responsibility. In some cultures, this is known as the warrior's initiation. And the warrior's initiation is the step that we take where we become responsible for ourselves. And we stop fighting the world and we accept it as it is. A warrior is responsible for their choices and their actions and how they respond to the world that they live in. They don't blame people. They don't attack people. They don't shame people. When things happen to them, they own the experience. They don't reject it. And these are some of the teachings that came out of these big transitions where great teachers of history, including Jesus, including the Buddha, Kung Fu Tzu, Confucius, or Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching, was this notion of adulthood and a step from childhood towards wisdom. Now we're stuck in a situation in our society where we are not graduating children into this warrior's code, where we take responsibility for our lives and ourselves and our actions. And we have a culture of safetyism where uh, people are wearing a victim's identity as a badge of who they actually are. And it's a false self. In the last several decades, I'll finish with this one today. Stephen J. Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of the Highly Effective People, observed in some of his trainings and coachings that there was a period decades ago where we lived in a culture where we emphasized the character ethic. Now, the character ethic is the level of trust that we have in ourselves and that we expect of other people, where we can do business on a handshake. And our character is how people judge us, whether we're honest, whether we're diligent, forthright, hardworking, compassionate, whether we live our dharma. The Hindus borrow the Hindi word dharma, which means duty, to act out our roles and responsibilities for the life that we face, and where necessary, make sacrifices for our families and our communities. That's the character ethic. And over decades, we began to develop the personality ethic. So the personality ethic is more superficial. It is some game playing. You know, how do you make eye contact? How do you shake hands? How do you establish a sort of a false persona that is engaging enough in the world that we live in to produce the results that you might want to achieve? And Covey didn't have a lot of great things to say about the personality ethic versus the character ethic. And unfortunately, now we've left the personality ethic behind. And we have embraced what I think is appropriately called a victim's ethic. And a victim's ethic is this childhood level of engagement with the world, where the world is conspiring against me, and those people are being mean, and life isn't fair, and it's very, very disempowered. It's like a child who's lost their parent and expects the world around them to act out the role of just parent to them. And that's just not the way the world is. So if you want to check out Chasing Quicksilver, I'd love it if you did. Start with the prologue. I talk about, my engagement with my friend George in that vision quest and in that exploration of self. And because storytelling or sharing stories that belong to indigenous cultures, even within those cultures, is protected, kind of like copyright. There are things I can't say about what George taught me out of respect. But the things that I learned from him about the structures and the process of storytelling allowed me to explore classical mythology and religions from around the world and identify patterns common to all of those different traditions, and identify some of the processes and structures of our psyche and our soul to aid in the exploration of who we are. My name is Shannon B. Douglas. This is While We Were Asleep.